You see the top of the National Park Service arrowhead on the screen. The camera pans down. You see in white letters the words National Park Service. Also in white letters, the title of the video, Treasures of Independence. Independence National Historical Park appears. Next, we see a video of the front of Independence Hall, panning from the top of the bell tower to the main hall itself. Next, we see a woman and a park ranger walking upstairs. A park ranger and a woman stand in the Governor's Council chamber on the second floor of Independence Hall. In between them is a telescope-type instrument sitting on a wooden tripod.
I'm the museum curator here at Independence.
The treasure we're sharing with you today is a transit instrument made by John Bird in London in 1760. It was one of several tools used by Charles Mason, an astronomer, and Jeremiah Dixon, a surveyor, to accurately determine the
modern
borders
map
between
appears showing the states of Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. The camera returns to the park
The border
ranger and
between
woman.
Pennsylvania and Maryland is often referred to as the Mason-Dixon line, sort of shorthand for these two individuals' names. Now, while you may not interact with borders as large as those surveyed by these two men on a regular basis, you interact with borders every day of your life, whether it's the home you live in, the streets around you, or your personal space bubble. These borders define the area around you. Now, this was just one of several tools used to mark the borders during the colonization of what would become the United States. This is part of the colonization process in which Europeans will mark out
A color-coded map appears showing both British and French land claims in North America. A modern map of North America appears showing the names of Native American tribes, both in English and their native languages. The camera cuts back to the park ranger and curator.
Well, yes, it was, because in the 1600s, Lord Calvert...
A black and white sketch of George Calvert appears. It's from the waist up. The camera goes back to the park ranger and curator. A pastel sketch of William Penn appears on the screen. It is from the shoulders up. The camera returns to the park ranger and curator.
Clearly mark where those borders were at, so it will lead to disputes.
And why would there be disputes about a boundary? Didn't everybody know where they lived?
Well, not necessarily. So when they're unclear, then you have to determine, well, who do I pay taxes to? Do I pay them to Maryland? Do I pay them to Pennsylvania? And so just like disputes today over borders and boundaries, it can lead to violence or lawsuits. In this case, it led to both.
In 1732, this dispute heads to a court in Great Britain. On the screen. It will not be until 1750 that a court hands down a ruling that settles the dispute. As we look at a modern map of the three states, we can see evidence of the ruling. First, let's take a look at the border separating Pennsylvania and Maryland. It looks like a straight line running east to west. The court ruled that the border separating the colonies would be a parallel line of latitude that lies 15 miles south of the city of Philadelphia. Next, let's look at the border separating Maryland and Delaware. As we see on the map, there is a peninsula that both states share. The southern border of Delaware is a straight line running east to west, halfway through the peninsula. The line stops in the middle of the peninsula and would be known as the midpoint. That also seems fairly straightforward. Next, things get difficult. Let's look at the northern border of Delaware. It looks as if it's semicircular. That's because the court ruled that a 12-mile radius be drawn around the town of Newcastle, Delaware. This line was to be drawn in a counterclockwise motion, starting on the western bank of the Delaware River. Finally, the western border of Delaware would consist of a line from the midpoint touching the radius around Newcastle. However, this was not a straight line, but a tangent line, which meant it intersected the radius at a 90-degree angle. This court ruling required a survey.
It took a while. There were several unsuccessful attempts before Mason and Dixon are hired in 1763. They and a crew of over 100 hired workers would spend 4 years marking and determining this border. So they basically cut a path over streams, rivers, mountains, and through forests to accurately mark those borders.
Mason and Dixon actually used this instrument.
They would use this instrument at night to observe specific stars. They would use it as a point of reference in their calculation of determining where they are at to make sure that they're accurately marking that border and they're on the right path. Some of the problems, though, is you can't do observations in one night. It also has to be clear. In addition, they're stopping every 10 to 11 miles because of the curvature of the Earth. With the technology that Mason and Dixon had, they did an amazingly accurate job of marking the borders between these colonies. But modern technology has allowed for an even more precise marking of the borders. But this transit instrument, the borders, and those boundary markers are connection to the past and those events. While the history of all these things are important, how we preserve it and take care of it is also equally important. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, Carrie?
Really interesting object, not only because of how it's made, but because of how it's used. Now, as I'm talking, I'm going to be sort of gesturing near it. So I'm going to put on my protective gloves, so just in case I accidentally touch it, I don't leave any of my sweat on the surface of the metal. Because if you look closely at the eyepiece, you'll see where somebody in the recent past touched it with ungloved hands, and their fingerprints etched right into the brass of which the telescope is made. Today, what we do to care for it is all of the metal components, which are brass, have a very thin coating of wax on them. You can't see it, but it's there to protect them from pollutants and from fingerprints. This is very, very heavy, so it stays here on exhibit on the second floor of Independence Hall and doesn't move. And that is really the best way to preserve anything, is just leave it alone and don't touch it. Because this is such a rare survival from our historic past. In 1869, this instrument was used for the observation of the transit of Venus, which is exactly what it sounds like.
An image of the transit of Venus appears.
Over the surface of the sun. Transit is used
Camera returns to the park ranger and curator.
And from Venus to the sun. A very important calculation. So important, actually, that it really brought the colonial Americans, onto the world stage of science in the latter part of the 18th century. And here's what I mean by that. The calculation was a big deal. Everybody's pretty excited about it. And the Royal Society of London, for example, sent astronomers all over the known world, even to what they called the South Seas, or the Pacific, the way we call it today, to take these measurements from various points. There was some in Greenland, and then, of course, in the British colonies in North America. And as you mentioned, you gotta have clear sky, whether it's at night or day, for using the transit. And it was a cloudy day in Europe and Britain on the day of the transit, and so no accurate measurements could be taken in either Britain or Europe. And the only accurate information that was collected in 1769 was that collected by the Philadelphians.
A map of colonial Philadelphia appears on the screen.
It is amazing, and it really
the camera goes back to the park ranger and curator.
Up to the notice of the rest of the Western world. And the idea that they were competent, the colonials were competent enough to gather this information, really essential, which wouldn't occur again in anybody who was then living his lifetime. And it was really kind of a sublime moment for the colonials, because they'd always been second-class citizens. Oh, those colonials don't know what they're talking about. Well, this proved that they did. And that makes this object this wonderful bridge between the real world of the 18th century and the intellectual world of the Enlightenment. And that's why we preserve objects, so that we can use them as touchstones to bounce through the doorway to the past, and from that doorway come back to our own world and understand a little bit more about our own.
Well, thank you, Carrie, for sharing this with us, and thank you for joining us, and hopefully you'll catch some more of our videos and see some of our other treasures here at Independence. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Camera looks closer at the transit instrument. It pans from top to bottom, showing the wooden tripod. Camera now takes a look at the transit instrument and pans from left to right, showing the telescope-like instrument going all the way down to the eyepiece. The screen goes black. The word credits appear in white letter. The credits begin to scroll from the bottom to the top of the screen. They read, on camera appearances, Jeff Sievert, Park Ranger, Carrie Dethorn, Chief Curator. Off-camera assistants, Adam Duncan, Cameraman and Editing, Jeff Sievert, Editing. Maps and images, in order of appearance. FEMA Region 3, courtesy of Federal Emergency Management Agency. European Land Claims, John Mitchell, a map of the British and French dominions in North America, with the roads, distances, limits, and extent of the settlements, 1755, courtesy of the Newberry Library, Newberry Digital Collection for the Classroom. Tribal Nations, courtesy of Aaron Carapella, Tribal Nations Map, Traditional Names and Locations, 2015. Lord Calvert, Unknown Artist, sketch of Sir George Calvert, 1st Baron and Lord, Baltimore, 1579 to 1632, painting circa 1620, courtesy of Wikipedia. William Penn, courtesy of Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Treasures Collection, 1957.8. Great Britain Map, Mull Herman, The World Described, or a new and correct set of maps, London, J&T Bowles, circa 1762, courtesy of Senderis Antiquariat. Transit of Venus, courtesy of Gert Vanden Wingengert, Associated Press. Colonial Philadelphia, courtesy of Maps of Pennsylvania. Music, Energy, courtesy of www.bensound.com. Use of images and/or music in no way constitutes an endorsement of the sites or their content.